King William Street was crowded on the November afternoon when a couple's furious row exploded from the post office and spilled onto the steps outside. As the quarrel escalated, the woman pulled a knife from her pocket and stabbed the man she was arguing with 3 times. It was murder, and in broad daylight. If ever a conviction seemed inevitable, it was in the case of Emma Kitty Byron, who killed her lover in front of dozens of witnesses. But within a month of her brutal crime, she would go from cold-blooded killer to sympathetic victim in a case that would prove the power of public opinion within the criminal justice system. Born in 1878, Emma Byron, who went by the nickname Kitty, came from a lower-class family. Her father was a brewer, but had died when she was still a child. Following his death, she, along with her mother and her younger sister, moved in with an older brother and his family. Unsurprisingly, the home was crowded, and it was rare that Kitty's belly felt full after their meagre meals. As soon as she was old enough to, Kitty was sent to work with a milliner in London, even though it was a notoriously poorly paid occupation. It would be during her employment in London that she met her lover, Arthur Reginald Baker. Reggie was some 20 years Kitty's senior and a somewhat successful stockbroker. He married late in life, at age 39, to Mabel Harrison and had 1 daughter. However, their union was not a happy one, and Mabel accused Reggie of violence, abusive language, adultery, and giving her a venereal disease. By 1902, she had left him to return to her father's home, citing cruelty and adultery as she filed for divorce. Reggie wasted no time after parting ways with Mabel, and he and Kitty moved in together at a boarding house in July. By this point, however, the pair was suffering a financial downturn. The reason they had moved into lodgings was because Reggie had lost money in the stock market and could no longer afford his apartment. Kitty had also been fired from her job due to poor timekeeping. Their relationship didn't seem any happier than Reggie's marriage. They were prone to loud, violent fights that were often caused by Baker's drinking. When sober, his landlady said he was a perfect gentleman, but those occasions were few and far between. He was heard to threaten Kitty with murder, was often seen pushing her, and she had told her landlady that he had once tried to strangle her. Despite the ever-increasing violence, Kitty remained besotted with her partner. Finally, after another noisy, violent row, the boarding house owner, Adrienne Laird, told Reggie that the couple would need to move out. He told her he planned to send Kitty away and asked to stay another week, which Mrs. Laird agreed to. According to one account of the conversation, he told Laird and her son that Kitty had no class and was a sex worker. To Kitty, he said it was Mrs. Laird who had commented about her virtue. When she later learned from their landlady that Reggie was planning to kick her out and had openly disparaged her character, she was heartbroken. With no job and now a potentially ruined reputation, she was terrified of what her future would hold if he truly left her. November the 10th was the day of the Lord Mayor's Show, one of the largest annual events in London. A new Lord Mayor is appointed each year, and a public parade is central to the inauguration ceremony. It was hard to find a busier day in the city. That morning, Kitty Byron tucked Reggie's letters to her in her pocket and visited a shop on Oxford Street. She purchased a spring knife and then went to the post office on Lombard Street to send a message to Reggie at the stock exchange. She wanted him to meet her there to hash out the details of his conversation with Mrs. Laird. The messenger boy could not find Reggie, but Kitty returned him to the exchange again. When Baker followed the messenger boy back to the post office, the clerk there asked him to pay the extra fees incurred for sending him back out. As he argued with the clerk over the dues, Kitty, late once more, rushed to the counter and begged him to pay, offering him a silver coin as a contribution. Reggie, annoyed at being pulled from work and then told he owed money for a message he never wanted to receive, refused. He pocketed Kitty's coin and turned to leave. Kitty followed him and they began to shout at each other near the post office entrance that led to King William Street. Other postal customers pushed past them as their argument grew louder and more heated. They spilled onto the street and Kitty revealed her new knife, the blade flashing as she plunged it into Reggie once, then again and again. Witnesses, including a passing labourer and a postal clerk, rushed to restrain Kitty and help Baker. Kitty let the knife clatter to the ground as Reggie tried to run, stumbling and falling in a heap about a yard from the wall opposite the post office. While one man held her wrists, Kitty threw herself toward Reggie's crumpled body, shouting, "Oh, Reggie! Reggie, let me kiss him." Reggie was taken to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, but it was too late. He had suffered 3 knife wounds, one to the left side of the head, another above his breastbone into the aorta, and one over the left shoulder blade. He also had a contusion above the right eye, from where his head had hit the pavement as he collapsed. The surgeon of the city police would later testify that the stab to his chest caused almost instantaneous death. The 3rd wound was inflicted as he was falling forward. While Reggie's body was examined at the hospital's morgue, Kitty was taken to Cloak Lane police station, searched and held in a cell. When she learned about her beau's death, she told Inspector Frederick Fox, "I killed him willingly, and he deserved it. And the sooner I am killed, the better." Later, she revised her story, telling him, "I bought the knife, I hit him, but I did not know I was killing him." Kitty Byron was charged with murder, and 4 days later, Arthur Reginald Baker was laid to rest at the Norwood Cemetery. When Kitty's murder trial began, the courtroom was packed with men Baker had worked with at the Stock Exchange, but they weren't there to sneer at Kitty. These men had funded her defense. Her guilt was never questioned. A queue of witnesses were ready to testify that they had watched her stab him repeatedly. Nor was she a respectable lady who had strayed into unfortunate circumstances. She was poor, unemployed, and possibly a sex worker. But she was young and beautiful, and Baker was older, mean, and had a reputation as a violent drunk. The members of the Stock Exchange hired barrister Henry Dickens, son of that other very famous Dickens, and he too was charmed and sympathetic to Kitty's plight nearly immediately. He would later write in his memoirs, quote, "I do not think I ever felt such real sorrow in connection with a client as I did in her case." End quote. His defense of Kitty was also lauded as one of the best of his career. As soon as the trial began, reporters started filling London's tabloid pages with a tale of a disadvantaged woman pushed to take drastic action against her tormentor. Kitty was a poor, wronged girl who looked younger than her 24 years, a struggling working-class milliner's assistant who had been dragged into a deplorable world. Reggie was the seducer, a drunk who was estranged from his wife, had a history of violence against women, borrowed money he never repaid, and had threatened to abandon a woman he had led astray. In Edwardian England, such a man was the most loathed sort, the very opposite of the masculine ideal of the day. Kitty was fragile, dainty, dark-eyed, and pitifully forlorn and caught. Reginald was a ghoul, a nightmare crafted by careful storytelling, so artful that those watching and reading about the trial soon forgot that he was the victim in this murder case. Ultimately, the jury had no choice but to find Kitty Byron guilty of murder. After all, no matter how sympathetic a character she made, she had been seen stabbing Reginald in a crowded street. But along with their verdict, the jury submitted a plea for mercy in the hopes of sparing her the death sentence. The judge that oversaw the case agreed with their recommendation and even wrote a letter to the Home Secretary after the trial asking for clemency. The public was even more supportive. It was not unusual for the family, friends and legal counsel of a convicted criminal to appeal for clemency, but Kitty Byron's support did not end there. Thousands of letters and signatures on petitions poured into the Home Office in support of Byron. Several trial jurors, the cutler who sold her the knife, and even Reggie's estranged wife Mabel, wrote impassioned pleas for clemency. The signers of these letters and petitions were not from a single demographic either. Men and women from the working, upper and middle classes were all represented. Most petitioners saw Kitty as a wronged woman, driven to madness. They hinged on the provocation of the event, stereotypes about women's weakness and the cruelty of Kitty's partner. Some wrote that a woman deserted would nearly automatically verge into hysteria and could not be held responsible for her action. Baker, meanwhile, had few defenders at his trial or afterwards. His memory was marred by his promiscuity, his inability to provide for either an estranged wife and daughter or a live-in partner, and his alcoholism. All of his failings served as both justification for and distraction from Kitty's seemingly premeditated murder, which the coroner had argued had been delivered with considerable force. On December the 22nd, Home Secretary Aretas Akers Douglas reduced Kitty's sentence from death to life imprisonment. She had escaped the worst possible fate, but her supporters still mourned their tragic heroine, spending the rest of her days behind bars. Petitions flooded the office in fresh waves, then a steady trickle calling for a reduced sentence over the following 3 years. The prisoner herself petitioned for an early release in 1906, but the Home Office denied her petition. Just when it seemed that Kitty's fate was sealed, she acquired a new powerful benefactor. Adeline, Duchess of Bedford, wrote to the Home Secretary asking for her release and offered to provide space at her own expense for the prisoner at a refuge for alcoholic women. On December the 1st, 1908, Kitty was released into the care of Lady Henry Somerset at Duxhurst. By this time, her sentence had been reduced to 10 years, which was not extremely uncommon for murderers in England at the time, especially women. Still, it was unheard of for anyone to serve less than a full 7 years behind bars for the crime. Kitty Byron did 6, with her final year spent at the Duxhurst Women's Refuge. While many retellings of the story end here, with Kitty disappearing from historical records, there are accounts that state she was far from a pleasant guest for Lady Henry Somerset. While her behaviour in prison had been that of a model detainee, at Duxhurst it's said that she displayed worrying signs of violence. She is said to have grown infatuated with a nurse named Annie Mapplebeck and would fly into uncontrollable fits of jealousy if she observed her speaking to anyone else. She threatened to kill the caretaker, even hiding a sharp penknife for the task for several days. Threw glasses, smashed plates, and attempted to burn down the cottage she was housed in. On the morning of December the 22nd, she presented Annie with a bottle of poison and tried to force her to drink it. Unlike her previous transgression, the target of Kitty's rage at Duxhurst was not a mean, drunk man. It was a patient, calm woman. The reports on Kitty's behaviour at the refuge were majorly problematic for the Home Office. Because Kitty was out on licence, she could not be returned to prison without a trial, which would be a public admittance of poor judgment. And since Kitty appeared sane and docile most of the time, finding 2 doctors to sign off on permanent institutionalization would also be challenging. Finally, the Home Office persuaded Kitty's unmarried sister to take her in on December the 29th, 1909. It's believed that she then moved to Coventry, where she lived out the rest of her life. The tale of Kitty Byron is a complicated one. While there's no doubt she was indeed a victim of domestic abuse who struck out against her abuser, was she also guilty of inflicting that pain on others? And there are also questions to be asked about the judicial system and if they would have extended such leniency to others who found themselves in such a situation. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.